She was 19 years old, standing on a porch that no longer belonged to her, holding $8 in coin that had been counted out twice by a lawyer who wanted no mistake in the arithmetic of her dismissal. That is where this story begins, though it is not where it ends, because 3 years after that humid Missouri morning, she would be standing on the deck of a boat that the whole river had pronounced dead, a boat that men with lanterns and crowbars had picked over for firewood and left in the mud as a lesson in what the current does to things nobody wants anymore. She would find something sealed inside it that no one else had thought to look for, something that would put her name back together after it had been taken apart in a lawyer's office with the same care one might use to fold a bedsheet. But that comes later. Right now, settle in, and if you would, tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because this is a long river, and it deserves good company on the way down. The morning she was cast out was the kind of morning the Missouri produces in early summer, thick with a heat that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be a storm, the air pressing close against the skin, the way wet wool presses against a shoulder. She had risen at the usual hour, out of a habit nobody had told her to abandon, dressed in the same gray calico she had worn to church 3 Sundays running, and gone down to a kitchen that already smelled of the coffee she would not be poured a cup of. There was no shouting in the house that day, no accusation thrown across a table. There was only a man in a black coat, a stranger to her, seated where her stepfather usually sat, with a leather folder open before him and a small stack of coin arranged in 2 neat columns, as though even money required tidiness before it could be handed to a person no longer wanted. She did not yet know, standing in that kitchen with the coin cooling in her palm, that the answer to why she had been let go so cleanly, so without malice, so entirely without a raised voice, was already sitting 11 years deep in river silt some 90 miles downstream, wedged into the mud of a bend the boatman called Widow's Elbow, inside a hull that had been sinking, board by patient board, since the year her father drowned. She did not know that the same current which had taken him from her would one day deliver her to the very thing that had taken him. She knew only the weight of $8, the particular grain of the porch boards under her boots, and the brass sextant wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her satchel, the one object in the world that still remembered her father's hands. To understand how a girl of 19 came to be standing in that kitchen with coin in her palm and no home behind her, it is necessary to go back some 7 years, to a spring when the river ran high and brown with snowmelt from up north, and a man with sun-cracked hands and a voice like slow water taught his daughter to read a current, the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture or stitch a hem. He was a pilot on the river, one of perhaps a dozen men on that stretch, who could take a 180-foot paddle-wheeler through a channel narrow enough to graze both banks with her wheelhouses, and he had done it for 18 years without losing a boat, which on that river, in those years, was no small thing to say of any man. He kept his charts rolled in tin tubes and his weather in his knees, an old brake that ached before storms, and he kept his daughter beside him on the hurricane deck from the time she was 7, not because the boat's owners approved of it, but because he had quietly decided they need not be consulted on the matter. He taught her first to listen, the particular hush of water over a sandbar, different from the hush of water over clear channel, a difference she could not have named in words at 9 years old, but could feel in the soles of her feet through the deck planking. He taught her to watch the color of the water change where a snag lay hidden beneath it, and to judge, by the set of a loaded barge's rail against the waterline, whether her cargo had been weighed honestly, or whether some hand along the wharf had lightened the manifest and left the difference in someone else's pocket. He gave her, on her 12th birthday, the brass sextant that had been his father's before him, not because she had any occasion yet to shoot a star, but because he wanted her to have something of the families that predated the boats, the debts, the whole uncertain arithmetic of freighting on a river that could rise 11 feet in a night and take a man's whole living with it. He drowned that same year, in October, when a boiler explosion sent 2 decks of a rival packet into the water not 40 yards from where he stood at his own wheel, and he went in after a child he did not know, and the current did what the current does, without malice, without accounting, the same current he had spent 18 years teaching his daughter to respect rather than fear. She kept the sextant. She kept the listening, and she kept, without knowing yet what use it would ever serve her, the particular and dangerous conviction that a river never lies to a person who has been taught properly how to read it. A conviction that would carry her, 7 years later, 90 miles downstream to a bend called Widow's Elbow, where something far larger than a boat had been sitting quietly in the silt, waiting for someone patient enough to ask it the right question. Her mother did not speak of the river again after that October, not once, not in the 7 years that followed, though the house they kept in the town above the levee sat so close to the water that its floorboards carried the current's low hum on quiet nights, a vibration you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. She was 12 when it happened, old enough to carry a coffin's weight in memory though not in muscle, and she noticed, the way her father had taught her to notice things, patiently, without alarm, that her mother's hands had begun to shake in a particular way whenever she signed her name to anything, a small tremor that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with arithmetic she could not make balance. The freight contract her father had held with 3 other river families collapsed within the year, the underwriters citing losses no one could quite explain, cargo weights that did not match manifests, that did not match the water damage claimed, and her mother, who had never once in 18 years of marriage kept a ledger of her own, found herself signing papers she did not fully understand, handed to her by men in clean coats who spoke slowly, as one speaks to a child or a widow, which in their eyes amounted to the same difficulty. The remarriage came 2 years later, in the spring, to a man named for his caution rather than his warmth, a merchant who dealt in dry goods and owed no one anything, and intended to keep it that way, and he was not unkind to her in any manner a court would recognize. He fed her, housed her, saw that she attended the schoolhouse until she was 15, but he possessed the particular coldness of a man who believed every obligation ought to have a stated term, and a girl who was not his blood was, to his mind, an obligation with an expiration written into the nature of things, whether anyone had troubled to write it on paper or not. She worked. She kept his ledgers better than his clerk did, though no one thanked her for it, and she noticed, the way she noticed the set of a current, that the household's books never quite matched what she remembered her father saying about honest weight and honest measure, small discrepancies that troubled her without yet naming themselves. She kept the sextant wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of a trunk. She kept, too, the habit of listening, to weather, to men's voices when they thought no one of consequence was in the room, to the particular silence that falls over adults discussing money in front of a girl they have already decided does not need to understand it. And it was this habit, more than any single lesson her father had given her, that would matter most on the cold Tuesday morning, still 4 years off, when the arithmetic of her stepfather's patience finally reached its stated term. The discrepancies she noticed were small at first, the kind of thing a careless eye would forgive and a tired hand would smooth over without a second glance. A manifest that listed 40 barrels of salt pork where she was certain, from having counted the wagon herself in the yard that morning, there had been only 36. A freight charge entered twice under 2 different dates, as though the clerk had simply forgotten his own hand had already made the mark. She did not speak of it. She had learned, in the 4 years since her mother's second marriage had settled over the house like a coat of dust that no one bothered to sweep, that a girl who pointed out a man's errors was rarely thanked for her arithmetic and often punished for her memory. So she kept the discrepancies the way she kept the sextant, wrapped and put away, and she told herself that she was only waiting, the way her father had taught her to wait on a falling river, before committing a boat to a channel that might not hold water enough to carry it. The house itself she came to know the way a pilot knows a stretch of river he has run 100 times, every board that complained underfoot, every window that stuck in wet weather, every hour of the day when the light came in low and gold across the kitchen table where she did the figuring long after the household had gone to bed. She grew from a girl of 15 into a young woman of 19 inside those same 4 walls, and if anyone in the town remarked on how quiet she had become, how careful, how unusually attentive to sums and sacks and manifests, for a girl with no head, they supposed, for figures, they did not remark on it to her directly, and she did not correct them. She had her father's sextant. She had her mother's silence, which she had come to understand now as a kind of exhaustion rather than coldness, though by then her mother too had been 2 years in the ground, taken by a fever the same spring the river ran unusually high, and the stepfather had not remarried, had simply gone on running his freight business and his household with the same flat, dispassionate competence, the girl in the corner of his ledger no different, in his reckoning, from a mule he fed and stabled because it earned its keep. She understood, without anyone saying so, that her keep was a sum being kept somewhere in his mind, tallied against a debt she had not incurred and could not repay, and that the day would come when the column closed. She did not know the date. She did not know the figure. She only knew, the way she knew weather from the color of a sky, that it was coming, and that when it came, no one would raise their voice. It came, as such things do, on a Tuesday, which she would afterward think of as an unremarkable day made permanently remarkable, the way a plain nail becomes significant once it has been used to hang the one picture a house cannot do without. The morning was humid, in the particular way of Missouri in early June, the air thick enough to tasting faintly of river mud and coal smoke drifting up from the landing 3 streets off, and she remembered noticing, before anything else, that the kitchen smelled of scorched chicory, because the stepfather had let his coffee boil too long while reading something at the table, a letter, though she did not yet know that it concerned her. He did not call her to the table so much as simply not send her away from it, which was, in that household, itself a kind of announcement. She stood at the edge of the room with a dish towel still in her hands, the linen damp against her knuckles, and she watched him fold the letter along its original creases with the unhurried precision of a man closing a transaction he had already, in some private ledger, closed some time before. He said that a lawyer would be by in the afternoon. He said this the way he might have said the flour needed ordering. She did not ask why. She had learned, in 19 years of watching him, that questions asked of a closed column earned nothing but a longer silence, and so she went about the morning's work as she always had, feeding the stove, mending a seam in a shirt that was not hers and never would be worn by anyone she loved, and she noticed, with the strange clarity that sometimes comes to people standing at the edge of a known ending, that the yard beyond the window was very green that year, greener than she remembered it, the grass grown up thick and glossy around the fence posts her father had once meant to replace and never had, and she thought, not for the first time, how strange it was that land went on being beautiful, regardless of who owned the right to stand on it. The lawyer, when he came in the early afternoon, wore a gray coat too heavy for the weather and carried a leather case that clicked shut with a small brass latch, a sound she would remember far longer than his face. He set a folded paper on the table and did not look at her directly while he spoke, addressing instead some point slightly to the left of her shoulder, as men sometimes do when the thing they are saying costs them nothing but they suspect, somewhere beneath the flatness of their own voice, that it ought to cost them something. He read from the paper in the tone of a man reading a list of goods received, and the words came out level and unhurried, as though he had rehearsed them somewhere on the ride over so that nothing in his own chest would catch. The estate, he said, had been settled according to the wishes of the deceased and the standing arrangements of the household, and the house and its furnishings, the acreage and the stock, the tools in the barn, and the linens in the press, all of it passed now to persons named in the document before him, none of whom were her. He said this the way another man might report the weather, or the price of grain, and she understood, listening to him, that he believed himself to be doing a kindness simply by not raising his voice. He counted the money out on the table itself, not into her hand, as though the wood between them were a kind of ledger book made solid, laying down each coin with a small definite click that she would also remember, long after she had forgotten the exact shape of his knuckles or the color of his eyes. $5 in silver, $2 in paper, worn soft as cloth at the folds, a single dollar in small coin, counted twice, though the sum did not change the second time any more than it had the first. $8 total, he said, as though the number itself were a kind of mercy, a figure arrived at by some fair and impartial arithmetic, rather than by the simple fact that it was what remained, once every other claim on the house had been paid its due. She did not cry, and she noted this about herself, with the same distant clarity she had felt looking at the green yard, filing it away, as a fact rather than a feeling. She asked him only one question, and it was not about the money. She asked what would become of the brass sextant that had sat for 11 years on the shelf beside her father's chair, the one thing in the house that had never belonged to the estate in any way the law could measure, because it had never once been used for farming or for household accounts, only for reading a river that no longer touched this particular piece of ground. The lawyer glanced toward the shelf, as if seeing it for the first time, and said, after a pause that told her he had not been asked to account for it, and did not know how, that he supposed she might keep whatever had been her father's outright, provided it carried no separate value on the inventory. She rose from the table then, and went to the shelf, and took the sextant down with both hands, the way a person lifts something that has already, quietly, become the only thing left worth carrying. The weight of it settled into her palms, the way it always had, brass gone warm from years of sitting near the wood stove, the arc etched with numbers her father had once traced for her by lamplight, patient as a man, teaching a child to read scripture. She did not look at the lawyer again. She wrapped the instrument in the same cloth her father had always used, a square of oiled canvas gone soft and dark at the folds, and she set it into the bottom of the small satchel she had brought, beneath the 2 changes of clothing and the folded paper on which the $8 had been recorded in a hand far steadier than her own would have been. The lawyer counted the money out a second time, aloud, as though the ceremony of it mattered more than the sum, $4 in silver, 3 in worn paper, and a single dollar in coin, so old the eagle had gone smooth as riverstone. He slid it across the table in a small stack, squared the edges with 2 fingers, and said that a receipt would not be necessary, that the matter was settled to the satisfaction of the estate. He did not ask where she intended to go. It did not occur to him, she would understand only later, that a young woman leaving a house on a Tuesday morning might need somewhere to go at all, as though the world outside the door were a general condition rather than a particular one she alone would have to navigate. She thanked him, because her mother, her stepfather's late wife, the only mother she had known past the age of 12, had raised her to be civil even to weather, and the lawyer was, in his way, only weather, a condition to be endured, not a man to be blamed. She walked out through the kitchen, rather than the front hall, past the pump handle she had worked 1,000 mornings, past the nail by the door, where an apron of hers had hung so long it had left a pale, unfaded patch on the wood behind it, and she did not allow herself to stand in the yard and look back at the house the way she had once imagined she would, if this day ever came. She had imagined, in fact, that it would feel larger than this, that being put out of a house, counted among the estate's furnishings for 11 years, would arrive with some thunder in it. Instead, it arrived the way the lawyer had delivered it, in exact figures and level tones, and she found that the plainness of it was almost a mercy, a thing she could carry without breaking under its ceremony. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder, felt the sextant's weight settle against her hip, and started down the lane toward the river road, not yet certain which direction along it she meant to take, only certain that whatever direction it was, she would take it walking, and alone, and with her eyes open. The river road, when she reached it, ran the color of weak tea, churned by cartwheels and the boots of men who worked the landings, and she walked its edge where the ground was firmer, keeping the water always in the corner of her vision, the way her father had taught her to keep it, never staring at it outright, only knowing it was there, the way a person knows a clock is ticking in another room. The August heat had settled into the valley by mid-morning, thick and unmoving, the kind that pressed damp cotton to the back of the neck and made the cicadas sound louder than they were. She passed a freight wagon stalled at a rut, its driver cursing at a mule with more patience than heat, and she passed a boy fishing off a half-collapsed pier who did not look up, and she passed, after perhaps 2 miles, the ferry landing where she had once stood as a girl of 8 holding her father's hand while he explained to her, unprompted, the reason the current ran faster on the outside of a bend than the inside, and why a boat that did not respect that difference would run itself aground before its captain ever understood why. She did not stop at the landing. There was nothing there for her to stop for, only the ferryman dozing in his chair with his hat over his eyes, and she had $8 now instead of the 11 she had left the lawyer's office with, having paid for a room the night before, in a boarding house that smelled of tallow and boiled cabbage, a room she had not slept well in, listening to a floor above her creak under some stranger's restless pacing. She walked on. The road bent away from the river for a stretch, through a stand of cottonwoods that offered shade she took gratefully, and it was there, resting with her back against a trunk and the satchel across her knees, that she first heard the name of the place, not spoken to her, but overheard, two men on horseback passing slow enough that their talk carried, one telling the other that the old sidewheeler down past the second bend had finally gone all the way over in the spring floods, that it had been sitting half sunk and useless for the better part of 11 years already, and now it was hardly more than a hazard to navigation, good for nothing but the iron a scrapman might strip off it. She sat very still after they had passed, turning the words over the way her father had taught her to turn over a sounding before trusting it. 11 years. A number that meant something to her, though she could not yet say what, only that it sat in her chest with a small cold weight, the way the sextant sat against her hip, and she found herself rising before she had decided to rise, and turning her steps not toward whatever town lay ahead, but toward the second bend, where the river, she was told, kept something of its own. The road to the second bend was not a road at all, but a suggestion worn into the grass by cattle in years, and she followed it with the sun climbing white and merciless overhead, counting her steps the way she had once counted riffles under a hull, a habit that steadied her hands when her mind wanted to run ahead of her feet. The satchel had grown lighter with every mile, not because its weight had changed, but because her arm had learned it, the way a body learns any burden it cannot set down. She passed a dead cottonwood split by old lightning, its inside black and hollowed, and she thought, without wanting to, that 11 years was long enough for a tree to die that way, and stand anyhow, refusing to fall, and she wondered if a boat could do the same. The land dipped before she saw the water, a long, slow bowl in the earth that told her the river had cut this bend 1,000 years before any man had thought to put a boat on it, and when she came over the last rise, she stopped, not from surprise, but from the particular stillness that comes over a person recognizing something before they have proof of it. The sidewheeler lay canted in the shallows a quarter-mile off, her stern sunk deep into silt gone hard as clay, her bow lifted just enough that the pilot-house still stood clear of the water, tilted, gray, windows long since starred and fallen in, and around her the current split, and rejoined the way current always splits and rejoins around a thing it has decided to live with rather than remove. She did not go down to it at once. She sat on the rise instead, drew her knees up, and watched the water the way her father had taught her to watch it, before ever setting a foot to a deck, not the surface, which lied more often than not, but the seams beneath it, the faint braiding where the current met an obstruction and turned. She watched for the better part of an hour, and in that hour, she saw what the two riders on the road had not thought to mention, what perhaps no one who called this wreck a hazard had ever troubled to notice. The river did not fight the hull. It moved around it the way water moves around a stone that has always been there, settled, patient, indifferent to time. No boat sinks that gently by accident. She had heard her father say that once, of another wreck, in another year, and she had not understood it then. She stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and started down the slope toward the water, the sextant's brass corner pressing warm against her hip with every step, as though it too had been waiting 11 years for someone to finally come and ask the river what it knew. The bank steepened as she went, and the grass gave way to a rubble of shale that shifted under her boots, so that she had to angle her steps sideways the way she had once seen deckhands walk a listing gangplank, weight low, knees soft, eyes forward. The paddle wheeler grew larger with every yard, and larger still, in a way that had nothing to do with distance, the way a thing grows when the mind stops dismissing it and starts truly looking. Up close the hull was worse than it had appeared from the ridge, streaked black with old pitch and green with river moss, and yet it was also, in a way the ridge had not shown her, more deliberate. The boat sat canted at an angle that a chance sinking rarely produced. She had seen enough wrecks in her childhood, pointed out to her from her father's shoulder as they walked the levee at Hannibal, to know that current-driven wrecks settled crooked, twisted, torn along their seams by the fight. This one sat almost level, tilted no more than a wagon might tilt on a gently sloped yard, as though someone had lowered it into the water the way a woman lowers a trunk into a cellar, with care, with intention, with an eye toward not breaking what was inside. She stopped at the waterline and let the current lap over the toes of her boots, cold even in the day's building heat, and she studied the hull the way her father had taught her to study a hull before ever loading it. Not the paint, not the name half scoured from the bow, but the waterline itself, the exact height at which the river met the wood. A boat that sinks from a torn hull settles unevenly, bow or stern first, whichever wound is worst. A boat that is deliberately scuttled settles level, because whoever opens her seams below the water does it evenly, plank by plank, so that she goes down slow and quiet, like a held breath finally released. This one had gone down slow and quiet. 11 years slow and quiet. She waded into her knees, skirt darkening and clinging, and pressed her palm flat against the hull's black timber, feeling for the give her father always checked for, the softness that meant true rot, and the firmness that meant only surface neglect over sound wood beneath. Her fingers found firmness, again and again, moving hand over hand along the waterline. She found firmness where the town's rumor had promised only rot, and each solid plank rang faintly under her knuckles, like a low bell struck under water, a sound with no business surviving 11 years of river silence. She stood there a long while, water pulling gently at her skirts, the sun climbing higher behind her, and she understood, with the same quiet certainty her father used to carry into a difficult crossing, that whatever this boat had gone down to hide, it had not gone down to die. She moved along the waterline the way her father had taught her to move along a gangplank in fog, one hand always in contact with something solid, never trusting her balance to open air. The hull curved away from her into deeper water where the current had scooped a long trench beneath the stern, and she did not go there yet. She worked forward instead, toward the bow, where the paddle wheel housing rose above the surface like the ribcage of something that had chosen, at the last, to keep its chest above water no matter what happened below. The housing was black with river slime, furred in places with a pale moss that came away wet and cool under her fingers. And beneath it, the iron bracing had rusted to the color of dried blood, but had not rusted through. She counted the bolts the way her father had counted them on the Delphine, murmuring the numbers under her breath without meaning to, and found that 6 of the 8 were gone entirely, sheared or pried loose, while 2 remained, stubborn and orange with corrosion, holding a joint that no longer needed holding. A boat readied for scuttling did not need bracing removed. Bracing removed meant someone had wanted something out of that housing before the water came in, something worth the trouble of climbing down into a settling hull with the current already rising past the knees. She stood back and looked at the wheel a long moment, the sun now fully up, and laying a hard flat light across the water that made the mudflats gleam like beaten tin, and a heron lifted off from the reeds behind her with a slow complaint, as if she had disturbed something that had been keeping its own counsel for 11 years. She let the sound settle. Then she waded on, past the wheel, toward the low door that marked the boiler deck, half swollen shut, its brass latch green and blind with verdigris, but still, when she pressed her thumb to it, faintly warm from the sun, as if some small life remained in the metal yet. She did not force it. Her father had never forced a latch in his life, not on a door, not on a difficult current, not on a man who did not wish to speak. He had waited, and read, and waited longer, and the river had always eventually told him what he needed to know. So she crouched instead, skirts soaking through, and studied the seam around the doorframe, the way silt had built against it on one side and washed clear on the other, a pattern that told her, without a single word spoken by anyone living, that this door had been opened from the inside sometime after the boat went down, opened, and shut again, and left to look untouched by everyone who was not looking closely. She was looking closely now. She ran her fingers along the seam a second time, slower, the way her father had taught her to read a gauge when the needle would not settle. Not by trusting the first glance, but by watching it through 3 full breaths, before deciding what it truly said. The silt told its story plainly once she stopped asking it to hurry. On the upstream side, the fine gray powder had drifted flush against the wood, packed tight by 11 years of current, undisturbed, patient. On the downstream side, it lay thinner, looser, in a shape that did not match the natural push of water at all. A shape more like a fan, spreading outward from the hinge, the kind of pattern left when something is worked open and shut, by a hand that did not want the door to seize entirely, even after there was no longer any reason for a living person to come and go. She sat back on her heels in the shallow water and considered what that meant, turning it the way her father had once turned a scrap of cargo manifest against a lantern, checking the ink for a second hand beneath the first. Someone had come here after the sinking. Not once, in a panic, to save what could be saved before the river closed over the deck, but more than once, deliberately, long after the town had already decided the wreck was worth nothing but its nails and its lumber. That kind of returning was not the behavior of a scavenger. Scavengers came for a single day, took what showed itself easily, and did not come back to a door that fought them. This was the behavior of someone keeping a thing hidden and checking, at intervals, that it remained so. She thought of the widow's warning, the way her voice had gone thin and careful at the word fire, and of the men on the porch who had laughed too quickly at the mention of the wreck, the particular laughter of people relieved to have a subject closed. She thought of her father's ledger book, the one column that had never balanced, no matter how many nights he sat with it by lamplight, and the way he had stopped speaking of it a season before the river took him, not because the trouble had resolved itself, but because he had, she understood now, learned something he did not yet know how to prove. The latch was warm again under her thumb, patient, waiting the way brass waits, without wanting anything for itself. She pressed, and felt the give beneath the corrosion, the faintest shift of metal remembering its old motion. She did not pull it open yet. She sat a moment longer in the brown water, with the hull ticking softly around her in the heat, and let herself feel, for the first time since she had waded out to this bend of the river, something closer to certainty than hope. She pulled the latch, and it came without violence, only a long, low groan of hinge iron, unaccustomed to motion, the sound less like a door and more like something exhaling after 11 years of holding its breath. The lid rose an inch, caught on swollen wood, and she worked her fingers into the gap and coaxed it the rest of the way. Patient, the way her father had taught her to be patient, with anything that had spent years believing it would never be opened again. Inside, the strongbox was dry. That was the first thing she understood, and it stopped her hand mid-motion. Dry, when the water outside had stood at that height for over a decade. Dry in a way that meant someone had sealed it with care, with wax or pitch along the seams, before the river ever rose to claim the rest of the boat. Someone had known what they were protecting, and had protected it well. She did not reach in at once. She made herself sit with that fact the way her father would have sat with a current he did not yet trust, letting it show its whole shape before he committed the boat to it. A sealed box, dry after 11 years underwater, hidden inside a pilot house that everyone on the bank called worthless. It was not the resting place of an accident. It was the resting place of an intention. When she finally lifted the folded oilcloth from the top, her hands were steadier than she expected them to be, steadier than they had any right to be, and beneath the oilcloth lay a ledger book, bound in the same dark leather as the one her father used to keep by lamplight, the corners worn pale from handling, the kind of wear that came only from a hand that returned to the same pages again and again, checking, rechecking, looking for an answer that would not come. She did not open it yet either. She held it against her chest for a moment in the brown standing water, feeling its weight, feeling the particular density of paper that had been written on in earnest, and thought of her father's column that never balanced, and thought that perhaps this was the other half of that same equation, waiting all this time on the far side of a river he had drowned in, without ever knowing how close he had come to the truth. Outside, the cicadas had gone quiet in the heat, and somewhere along the bank, a heron lifted off the shallows with a slow, deliberate beat of wings, as though even the birds understood that something in the day had shifted. She wiped her hands on her skirt, tucked the ledger inside her shirtwaist against her skin, where the damp would not reach it further, and began the long, careful work of climbing back up through the tilted decks toward the light, carrying with her the first proof she had ever held that her father had not been careless, only close. The climb out was slower than the climb down had been, as it always is when a person carries something they cannot afford to drop. She went hand over hand along the canted joists, feeling for the ones that had not softened, testing each with her weight before she trusted it, the way she had been taught to test ice on a pond, though there had never been ice on this river warm enough to matter. Twice her boots slipped in the black mud that had settled into every low place, and twice she caught herself against the frame of a door that no longer hung true, and both times she felt for the shape of the ledger against her ribs before she felt for anything else, before she checked her own footing, before she checked the drop beneath her, and only when she was certain the book had not shifted did she let herself breathe again. She came up through the forward hatch into daylight that seemed too bright and too ordinary for what she carried. The sun still sitting where it had been an hour before, the river still moving past the hull with its same patient indifference, as though the boat had not just handed her the missing half of an argument that had ruined her family. She sat on the deck a while with her back against the pilot-house wall, not opening the ledger, only holding it, watching a towboat pass far out in the channel, with its whistle sounding once, twice, the sound carrying flat across the water the way sound does on humid afternoons. And she thought of her father's voice explaining draft and displacement at the kitchen table with a spoon and a bowl of water, and she thought that he would have wanted her to read this the way he had taught her to read everything else, slowly, and only once she was steady enough not to mistake hope for evidence. She waited until the shaking in her hands had gone, before she untied the twine that had held the oilcloth wrapping for 11 years, and even then she did not open to the first page, but to the last, the way her father had always checked a column's final sum before trusting its beginning. The final entry was dated in a clerk's careful hand, the ink browned but legible, a column of weights beside a column of names, and beside one of those names, in a hand she recognized from 100 childhood evenings, the name of a small freight contract that had once belonged to no one but her father. She sat with the page a long time, not moving, the heron long since gone from the shallows, the cicadas beginning again in the heat, and somewhere beneath the stillness of her own held breath she understood that she was no longer looking at a mystery. She was looking at a debt. She read the column again, and then a third time, because her father had taught her that a number seen twice was a fact, but a number seen 3 times was a fact you could carry into a courtroom, and she meant to carry this one somewhere. The weight beside her father's contract read 4,000 pounds of milled lumber consigned for delivery downriver in the spring of the boat's last season, and beside it, in the same clerk's hand but pressed harder into the paper, as if the pen itself had been reluctant, a second number had been written, and then struck through, 6,200, the true weight, she understood, before someone had decided the manifest should say otherwise. She had watched her father argue with agents over such differences before, in the kitchen, in a voice she had thought at the time was only tiredness, and she understood now that it had not been tiredness at all. It had been a man watching the ground shift under a debt he did not owe. She turned the pages backward from the last toward the first, the way she had begun, and found the same pattern repeated under other names she did not know, then one she did. A family, too, Ben's downriver, who had lost their freight license the same autumn her father drowned, and whom she remembered only as a mother and 3 children boarding a train east, with trunks that seemed too light for the distance they were traveling. She had not thought of them in years. She thought of them now with a clarity that felt almost physical, a weight settling low in her chest, and she made herself breathe slowly the way she had learned to on the roof of the pilot-house, in and out, until the anger cooled into something she could use. The strongbox itself she had not fully searched, and she turned to it again in the failing light, running her fingers along its seams for a second compartment, the kind her father had once shown her in a captain's writing desk, hidden beneath a false floor no wider than a hand. She found the seam by feel before she found it by sight, a hairline where the grain did not match, and she pressed until it gave with a small, dry sound, like a knuckle cracking. Beneath it lay a single folded letter, unsigned, addressed to no one, the paper gone soft and gray at its folds, and she held it without opening it, aware suddenly of how quiet the hold had become, how far the light had traveled across the floor since she had first sat down, and how very much heavier the boat around her suddenly felt, as though it too had been waiting 11 years for someone patient enough to ask it the right question. she did not open it at once. She set it on her knee, the way her father had once set a chart he did not yet trust, weighting its corners with 2 fingers, as though it might otherwise fold itself back into hiding, and she let her eyes travel once more around the hold before she allowed herself the letter's contents, the barrels stacked wrong, the manifest sheets scattered like leaves after a wind, the strongbox open now on both its levels, like a mouth that had finally decided to speak. Outside, the light was going the color of weak tea, and somewhere above her the hull ticked and settled the way it always did. Toward evening, wood cooling, iron drawing tight, sounds she had come to know the way other women knew the creak of their own porch steps. She had learned, these past months, not to hurry a boat's confessions. A hull gave up its truths at its own pace, in its own order, and a person who forced the matter usually ended up believing something convenient instead of something true. So she waited a little longer, and in the waiting she thought of her father on the roof of the pilot house, teaching her to read the sky before she was permitted to touch the wheel, telling her that the river always finished its sentence if you had the patience to let it. That impatience was the one vice a pilot could not afford, because the water did not care how badly a man wanted an answer. She thought of the $8 counted out on a lawyer's desk in a town that felt, now, like it belonged to someone else's life. She thought of how far she had come from that morning, not in miles alone, but in the slow accumulation of things she now knew that she had not known then. How Silt lied, how a manifest could be made to lie more elegantly than Silt ever could. How a boat, scuttled on purpose, left marks different from a boat merely abandoned to chance. When she finally unfolded the letter, the paper resisted her, stiff with old damp, and she worked it open, with the same care she gave to a swollen hinge, a fraction at a time, so as not to tear what 11 years of river air had already made fragile. The hand that had written it was unfamiliar to her, narrow and hurried, nothing like the broad, confident script on the manifests above. She read the first line twice before its meaning settled, and when it did, she felt the cold spread through her the way river water spreads through wool, slow and total, and she understood that whatever this was, it had not been written for the eyes of anyone who was ever meant to find it, least of all a 19-year-old girl sitting alone in a drowned hold, with the light nearly gone, and the whole boat listening. The line read, "If the manifest is ever recovered, let it be known that the weights entered were not the weights loaded, and that this was done at instruction, not at my own hand." She read it a third time, tracing each word with her forefinger, as though touch might confirm what sight alone seemed unwilling to. The instruction, the letter went on, had come from above the pilot house, from men who signed their names to freight contracts, and never once walked the levee to see what was actually carried aboard. Men who trusted numbers on paper more than the boat itself trusted its own draft. Whoever had written it had known, even then, that the numbers were false, that a boat loaded to sink lower in the water than any manifest admitted was a boat lying to the river as surely as to the men who paid for its cargo. And a boat that lies to the river, her father used to say, is a boat the river will eventually correct. She lowered the letter into her lap and sat very still, listening to the small sounds a wreck makes when it believes itself alone, water working somewhere below, a beam settling under its own patient weight, the wind finding some new gap in the hull to whistle through. Outside, the light had thinned to the color of weak tea, and she understood without needing to check that she had perhaps 20 minutes before dark made the ladder up through the hold too dangerous to risk. And still she did not move. Instead, she turned the letter over, searching for a name, a date, anything that might anchor the confession to an hour and a place the way her father had taught her to anchor every reading of current or cargo. Never trust a number that cannot tell you when and where it was taken. There was no signature. Only, at the very bottom, in the same hurried hand, a single line that had been struck through once, lightly, as though the writer had meant to erase it, and then thought better of finishing the job. The Whitfield contract was not the only one, but it was the one I could not forget. She read her own family's name in a stranger's ruined handwriting, and felt the boat go very quiet around her, quieter than 11 years of silence had ever made it, as though it too were waiting to see what she would do with what it had just handed her. Somewhere above, The last of the daylight touched the broken glass of the pilot-house window and slid away, and she sat in the dark hold, holding the one page that finally named why the river had taken more from her than it had ever given back. She did not move for a long while, and the stillness itself became a kind of instrument, the way her father had once told her that a boat at rest still speaks if a person is patient enough to listen to what the hull is doing against the water. She listened now to the boat's old timbers ticking as the evening cooled them, and to the small sound of the paper trembling faintly in her own hand, and she understood that the trembling was not fear but recognition, the particular shiver of a thing finally matching the shape it had always been rumored to have. She folded the page along its original crease, careful not to widen the tear at the corner, the way she had learned to fold a chart so it would not crack along the fold line after years of handling. She did not read it again that night. She wrapped it instead in the square of oiled canvas she had been keeping the ledger pages in, and she placed it inside her father's sextant case, beneath the brass instrument itself, where she reasoned no water and no careless hand would find it before she chose to let it be found. Then she climbed up out of the hold and sat on the deck in the dark, listening to the river slide past the hull the way it had slid past it for 11 years, indifferent to the names it carried underneath its water and the names it had ruined above it. In the morning, she went into town for the first time in 9 days, not to speak of what she had found, but to ask a small, careful question of the postmaster, phrased so plainly that it would not draw suspicion, whether letters addressed to a shipping concern once operating upriver, a firm whose name she had seen stamped faintly on 2 crates near the stern, were still received or forwarded anywhere at all. The postmaster, a heavy-set man with ink-stained cuffs, said the firm had dissolved years back, its principals scattered, one dead of fever, one gone west, and one, he believed, still living not 40 miles distant, farming now, having put the river behind him the way a man puts down a tool he no longer trusts his hand to hold. She thanked him and left before he could ask why a girl in a salvage-stained dress wanted to know such a thing, and she walked back toward the bend, with the sun already hard on the back of her neck, turning the name over in her mind, the way her father had once turned a current over in his, testing it for the place where it would carry her, and the place where it would not. The name was Alden Pruitt, and she carried it back to the wreck the way a person carries water across dry ground, cupped, careful, unwilling to spill a drop of it before she understood what it was for. She did not go to him that day, nor the next. She had learned, in the months since the bend had become hers in all but paper, that haste was the one currency the river never honored, and that a fact allowed to sit undisturbed for a week would often reveal, on its own, whether it was load-bearing or merely decorative. So she went back to the hull instead, back to the stripped ribs and the strongbox now dried and opened on the cabin table in town, and she read the manifest again by lamplight, this time not for the shock of what it said, but for the pattern of it, the way her father had taught her to read, a current not by its surface, but by what it did to everything floating on it. The manifest listed weights, not 1 weight, but 2, a declared figure in a clean, confident hand, and beside it, in a second hand pressed lighter into the page, an actual figure, smaller by a consistent fraction on every entry, as though someone had gone down the column afterward, correcting a lie into a private truth, only the ledger itself was meant to know. She set a ruler against the numbers and found the fraction held steady across 4 seasons of shipments, decade after decade of it, cotton and grain, and machined iron, all shaved by the same patient hand, into a shortage no single shipper would ever notice alone, but which, summed across every hull the firm had ever loaded, became a fortune large enough to explain a scuttled boat far better than any accident of sandbar or storm. She thought of her father's contract, the one line in the county book she had already copied twice into her own small ledger, and she matched the date against the manifest's middle years, and found it there, waiting for her the way a snag waits under still water, patient, unhurried, entirely unconcerned with how long it took to be found. She closed the strongbox lid and sat with her hands flat on it a long while, not from grief, though there was grief in it, but from the particular stillness that comes to a person when a question they have carried, without naming, finally receives its shape. Outside, the boarders' hammering had gone quiet for supper, and the river moved past the way it always had, indifferent, generous, keeping its own accounts. She rose, banked the lamp, and began, for the first time, to write down exactly what she meant to say to a farmer 40 miles distant who had once put a tool down and told himself he would never need to pick it up again. The letter she wrote that evening was short, because she had learned by then that short letters traveled faster and were trusted sooner than long ones, and because she had nothing to gain from dressing the truth in more words than it needed. She wrote the date at the top the way her father had taught her to date a log entry, exact to the day, and she wrote the farmer's name below it, and she wrote that she had found his account in a manifest recovered from the wreck at the bend, and that the weight recorded against his shipment did not match the weight the mill had paid him for, and that she believed she could show him the difference in his own handwriting if he still kept his receipts. She did not write the word fraud. She had learned that too, from watching how the county clerk's face closed whenever a stronger word was used, before the facts had been laid out plain enough to stand on their own. She sent the letter by the same boy who carried her mail twice a month to the landing, and she went back to the strongbox and began the slower work of matching names, one by one, against the county book she had copied by hand through 2 winters of evenings when the boarders were asleep and the stove was the only sound in the house. Some of the names she recognized from her childhood, families who had freighted grain and hides through the same low season her father had, families who had quietly stopped freighting altogether within a year or two of the manifest date, without complaint, without explanation. The way people quiet themselves when they have decided a loss is simply the shape the world has taken, and arguing with it will cost more than accepting it. She wrote to 3 of them that week, and to 5 more the week after, and the answers came back slowly, the way answers do from people unused to being written, to about anything but debts owed rather than debts owing them. Not every reply was welcome. One man wrote back only to say he wanted no part of stirring old water, that he had made his peace with the loss and built his life around its shape, and that he would thank her kindly to leave his name out of any accounting she meant to bring before the county. She read that letter twice, folded it, and set it in the strongbox with the others, understanding for the first time that not every wound wanted the mercy of daylight, and that patience meant knowing which doors to knock on twice, and which ones to let stand closed. The letters that did come back willing, though, arrived with a weight that surprised her, the way a small stone can carry more than its size once someone has been waiting years to set it down. A widow in the next county over sent a page and a half in a careful, unpracticed hand, describing 40 bushels of corn she had watched loaded onto a barge in the autumn of the fraud, weighed twice at her insistence because she had not trusted the clerk's tally the first time, and paid for at a figure so far under what she knew the crop to be worth that she had gone home that night and cried in front of her children, which she had never done before or since. She had kept the receipt in a tin behind her stove for 11 years, she wrote, not because she believed it would ever matter, but because throwing it away had felt like agreeing with the number written on it. She sent the receipt itself, worn soft at the folds, and asked only that it be returned to her when the accounting was finished, whatever the accounting turned out to be. Clara set the receipt beside the manifest pages and saw, for the first time laid flat and side by side, how closely the numbers matched, not roughly, not by the generous approximation 2 old papers might be expected to share, but to the bushel, to the dollar, the fraud recorded twice over by 2 hands that had never known of each other's existence. She sat with that a long while in the lamplight, the strongbox open on the table, the river outside making its patient, indifferent sound against the hull, and understood that she was no longer building a case for one family's grievance, but assembling, letter by letter, the shape of a wrong done to a whole stretch of river at once, methodically, over years, by men who had never once had to look any of them in the face while they did it. She began keeping a ledger of her own then, separate from her father's, a plain notebook bought for a few cents at the mercantile, in which she copied each name, each figure, each date, in the neat hand her father had once taught her for logging draft and current, because a number written carelessly, he used to say, was a number nobody downstream could trust. She did not yet know what she would do with the pages once they were full, but she filled them anyway, night after night, the way a person lays plank after plank onto a hull long before the boat is seaworthy enough to name. The names, once she had enough of them gathered, began to form a kind of map in her mind, not so different from the charts her father had kept of snags and shoals, places where a careless pilot might run a boat aground if he did not know to read the water's surface for what lay beneath. Here a family in the county upriver who had lost a mill to debts nobody could explain. There a widow 2 towns over who had signed away a parcel of bottomland for a sum that never matched what the ledger, in her father's careful hand, showed the cargo had actually weighed. Each name a separate grief, and yet each one bent by the same current, the same patient and deliberate hand at the tiller, steering them all toward the same ruin without ever once raising its voice or showing its face. She began to understand, turning the pages by lamplight with her sleeves pushed back and her father's sextant sitting closed on the table beside her like a small brass witness, that what she was building was not a grievance but an argument, and that an argument, to hold, needed to be built the way a hull was built, seam by seam, each plank checked against the one before it, so that no single weak joint could sink the whole. She did not speak of this work to the men who came each week to help with the framing and the caulking, though she watched them sometimes, wondering how many of their own father's names might yet surface in the pages she was filling. She kept the notebook wrapped in oilcloth in a locked drawer of the pilot-house desk, the same desk her father had once stood behind with his hands steady on the wheel, and she took it out only after the lanterns along the bank had gone dark, and the frogs had taken up their long argument with the night. The work of the boat and the work of the ledger ran alongside each other now, 2 hulls rising at once, one of white oak and iron bolts, the other of ink and names, and she could not yet say which one would carry her further downriver. But she trusted, the way her father had taught her to trust, a current she could not see but only feel through the deck beneath her boots, that the 2 would meet somewhere ahead, at some bend she had not yet rounded, and that when they did, she would know exactly what to do with what she was carrying. The bend came, as bends always do, on an ordinary Tuesday in April, 18 months and 11 days after the morning she had first stood in the shallows, with her father's sextant pressed against her ribs and $8 folded in her boot. A man arrived on the bank in a gray coat too fine for the mud, introducing himself as counsel for the shipping concern that had once owned the vessel under a different name, and he did not raise his voice, because men like him never needed to. He spoke of liens, of abandoned salvage never properly filed, of a court in the county seat that might yet see the boat reclaimed for the company that had let it rot for 11 years. He smiled in the particular way of men who believe paper always outlasts patience. She listened without interrupting, the way her father had taught her to listen to an engine before deciding what was wrong with it, and when the man finished, she asked him only one question, whether the company still held record of the manifests filed the season the boat went down. He said, with the faint impatience of someone certain the answer did not matter, that such records were the company's own affair and none of hers to ask after. She did not argue the point there in the mud. She simply thanked him for the courtesy of his visit and watched him ride back toward town with the unhurried satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. That evening she brought the oilcloth notebook up from the locked drawer for the first time in daylight, and she read through it again from the beginning, not for what it told her about the dead, but for what it would tell a living judge. Every name, every weight, every discrepancy between what had been loaded and what had been claimed, it was there, plain as the grain of the wood beneath her hand, needing only to be carried into the right room and read aloud by someone the county could not dismiss as a girl with a grudge. She thought of her father then, not the pilot who had drowned, but the boy he must once have been, learning to read water from someone before him, passing the knowing down the same way it had come to her, quiet and unspoken and entire. She closed the notebook, wrapped it again, and looked out at the hull rising pale in the moonlight, patched but sound, waiting. There was a court date now. There was a name to clear and a name to give the boat once it was cleared. And there was, she understood without needing to say it aloud, only one direction left to go. The court sat in a room too small for the weight of what was said inside it, a county clerk's office with a ceiling stained by years of wood smoke and a judge who listened to the ledger read aloud the way a man listens to weather he cannot change but must still account for. She stood at the back in a dress she had mended twice and let the numbers speak instead of her voice, because the numbers did not tremble the way she might have. When it was finished, The judge said her father's name without hesitation, without the small pause men had once given it, and struck through the old finding the way a man strikes a debt paid in full. She did not weep in the room. She waited until she was outside, in the ordinary daylight, before she let herself stand still with her hand against the warm brick and simply breathe. The salvage claim followed within the month, granted under the custom the river had kept longer than any court, that a vessel raised by labor belonged to the one who raised it, provided the raising was honest, and the debts of the dead were paid from what it earned. She paid what remained owed to the two men who had bent iron beside her, and to the boy who had learned to read draft marks at her elbow without ever being told he was being taught anything at all. She kept the compass in the small drawer beneath the wheel, and the sextant on the shelf where morning light struck it first, and she did not remove either, because a boat's instruments are also its memory. She named it for her father in the plain lettering the old boats had worn, no ornament to it, no flourish, because he had never asked for flourish in his life, and would not have wanted it painted onto the last thing that carried his name into the world. On the morning she took the wheel for the first true run down river, loaded honest, weighed honest, logged to the last pound, the men on the bank did not call out to her the way they once had. They watched instead, the way men watch weather they have learned to respect. Seasons turned into years the way the river turns a bend, without asking permission of the banks. She grew known not for what she had found, but for what she had refused to leave unexamined. A boat, a debt, a name, each one read as patiently as her father had taught her to read. Water, current beneath the surface, always telling the truth, to whoever was willing to slow down enough to hear it. And if you have stayed this long beside the fire, tell me where you are listening from tonight.